Welcome back to Stanford's campus, beautiful Stanford's campus. I'm here with Gilad Naor. He's ex-Amazon, ex-Facebook, a senior engineering manager. Wonderful coach especially for managers, spending a lot of time talking to managers about their career, about preparing for interviews, which is what we want to talk about today, which is preparing for manager behavioral interviews. So if maybe you're a new manager and you've never gone through a hiring process as a manager, maybe you became a manager after you were an IC, what's different about manager behavioral loops than IC loops?
It's a great question, and it starts with what problem is the interviewer trying to solve. They're trying to see whether you will be successful at their company. And now they're not trying to evaluate whether you'll be a good engineer. They're trying to evaluate whether you'll be a good engineering manager. And management is a different career track than engineering. You need to be competent as an engineer. You need to be competent as a leader. You need to be competent in just managing the execution. So it's a very broad set of competencies, and that is one of the distinguishing factors between engineering and manager interviews, is just the breadth of potential topics that the interviewer is likely to evaluate.
Yeah, what are those topics? Like, what do you think you'll be evaluating in a manager loop that you won't be evaluating in a IC loop?
So depending on the level, there is some overlap, especially at Staff Plus. So being able to execute on a large project is definitely something that is a manager requirement and may not be as much of a requirement for engineers at certain levels. The ability to influence without authority when you work with cross-functional partners, and also the ability to lead with authority, and how do you exercise or not exercise your authority is another set of examples there. And also, very important is how do you actually grow the organization is a very common theme that is mostly unique just for manager interviews.
I know at some companies they will identify different kinds of interview types, and they will give managers different interview types based on their level, of course, based on whether they're manager and IC. Is that pretty common among different companies? If I'm a candidate coming in, will I kind of know this is an interview about leadership, or this is an interview about people? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, in most companies these days, you will get information ahead of time from the recruiter on what to expect for each of the interviews. And for manager specifically interviews, you will be told what each of the interviews is actually going to be focused on in most cases.
So if you're a manager preparing for these interview loops, how should my preparation look different if I'm a manager or for an IC?
So it's about story selection. 90% of the work is in choosing the right stories and preparing effectively for talking about these stories. And so the first thing you should do is try to understand the problem space that the interviewer, the company is going to evaluate. So we talked about building organizations. That is one component. You should have examples of building your organization. That can be about hiring, but hiring is just one part of building the team. How do you coach and grow the people on the team? Do you have examples of promoting engineers? The flip side of that is managing quote-unquote low performers. How do you handle that? That is a very common situation that is asked in pretty much every manager interviews. So it's starting with this ideation process on what classes of stories you should have, and preparing, brainstorming various examples you have from your career. And what I always recommend is do it in several passes. With the first pass is just writing a list of the stories. Take a step back, the next day come back and try to ask yourself, what was hard about this situation? What specifically made it challenging? And often you'll find after a day that maybe the story was not that challenging. Maybe there was a low performer because they just were a wrong hire that someone before you hired, then you joined the team, you identified that, and you had to manage them out. Okay, that's a nice story, but depending on the level, that may not be enough. If you think about what made it hard in this situation, the most interesting part was how did you identify it quickly? What did you do afterwards? A much more interesting story can be an engineer who used to be great and all of a sudden they're not doing great. And then in the noticing, you're showing signals on how you avoid recency bias or star bias. And then there's more work in actually debugging why things have changed. You can address the symptoms, you can dig deeper to find the root causes. And so you want to have this second pass where you filter the stories, so you really have a smaller set of stories that are show you making hard decisions, show you working through challenging situations.
Right, and I think something that we give IC's advice a lot about behavioral interviews is when you're telling a story, make sure that you reflect a little bit about learnings, right? Things that you have taken away, right? And that's probably really important for these manager type interviews, right? And I think that's maybe what you're getting, an extension of what you're getting at, which is if you can find those really deep moments of how you bent the curve, how you made a difference, then that can be some kind of reflection or learning that you can give to the interviewer.
Yeah, exactly. You want to show how you grow. And for manager and more senior engineering roles, it's also how do you propagate your learnings. That's a really interesting thing where you can show you didn't just prepare for the interview and thought about what can I say that I learned from this. That's really transparent, actually, for the interviewer. And if you can show that you did the actual retrospect, the actual learning in real time in that situation, and then you took action based on that, that is a much stronger signal for the interviewer.
Right, right. So this sort of theme of being a manager and being able to scale yourself and scale the impact that you make and become a multiplier. It's not just in the story itself, but also how you took that story and what you did afterwards.
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense. We've talked a little bit about stories, and I think that's super common that people ask, tell me about a time when you had this situation, right? Very common. Are there other really common story or question types that fit into a manager interview?
So one is about execution. So it can be tell me about a time when you led a large project and it's a multi-month project. That is a bit different just because the scope of what you can talk about is really large, and so you need some different strategies on how to approach that. A second very common theme of questions is tell me about your approach to, say, one-on-ones, or how would you approach a situation like? And that gets into another difference between manager interviews and mostly IC interviews is you need to have a philosophy, a set of guiding principles, some frameworks, some rules of thumb, some heuristics that you've built over your career to help you make hard decisions. Because a lot of management is really about making those decisions when there's no clear right or wrong, and you still need to make a decision. And that's where having a framework, having a way that you do things shows the interviewer that you've built it up over time through reading what other people have done and also adapting and creating your own systems based on your own lived experiences.
So I know a really common question, we talked about hiring, but another common question might be something like, how do you approach one-on-ones with your reports, right? As one of the greatest hits of these manager interviews. Like, give me an example of some framework. How would I talk about that response?
So I'll tell you about the framework I teach managers. You don't have to use this one. It's important to have a framework. And first of all, a meta framework is, what am I trying to get out of this meeting? Why am I even here in this room? And just showing that you think about this question already puts you ahead of the pack. And then the framework I like to recommend for one-on-ones is building what I call the tip pyramid. And the basis is trust. The layer above that is information, and the top layer is progress. And each layer builds on the layers below that, and you can always expand the pyramid. And it starts with trust, which needs to go both ways. So you need to earn your direct trust. You also need to understand the boundaries of where you can trust them. That will help you delegate the right work to the right person at the right time. Next up is information, where, yes, you can manage the information flow to the right person at the right time. Another common missed opportunities in one-on-ones is gathering information about other people in your team. So it's not just about you and that person in that room, it's an opportunity for you to help everyone on your team. And so you want to gather information. And the last step is to actually make progress towards what matters. That can be through coaching, that can be so through, hey, let's pair program this together and use that as an opportunity to learn about this person, provide on-demand coaching, work on specific career growth plans. So that's the framework I use. It's more important to have a framework to show that you've thought about how to best use this time, because most managers spend a significant amount of their time in one-on-ones. And if you've never thought, is this a good use of my time? Am I being useful to this person? Then it shows you're not really prioritizing your time and leveraging yourself effectively.
So let's suppose someone hasn't had the opportunity to work with you as an amazing manager coach, and they don't have one of these frameworks, maybe around one-on-ones. Maybe they're out of a job right now, so they're looking for a job. They're preparing for these interviews, and they probably run a bunch of one-on-ones in the past. How would you coach someone like that to sort of come up, back apply one of these 2020 vision sort of things to come up with what their framework is?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's looking backwards and trying to identify common themes. Everyone has a framework, even if it's implicit. It's better when you think and consciously do the work to articulate and define how you approach things. That can help you stress test that, find maybe weak spots and improve on them. But even if you haven't done any of that, you had an implicit system of how you ran one-on-ones. And what I recommend is start with impact, because companies are not hiring managers, especially in 2026, because they need someone to be a care bear for this person. They're hiring managers to get more results. So start with situations where something that happened in a one-on-one ended up leading to a significant outcome. It can be having a one-on-one and just feeling something was off about the conversation, and then doubling down on that and figuring out that someone is thinking about moving to a different company, and then working proactively with them and improving how they can be successful and them staying. That is something that most engineers just let you know after they've decided, after they have a new offer. And if you can catch it early, you have agency, you have ability to react. So this is an example of what you should look for when you look backwards. Try to find examples where one-on-ones led to great outcomes, and then find the common themes. But even if you don't, just having those examples to show in the interview already puts you in a great place.
Yeah, it can be difficult, I would imagine, to prepare for one of these kind of values-oriented questions if you don't know what they are. So I think we've talked about a couple of them, but maybe we could come up with a quick list. I know that we always give people advice not to prepare for specific questions, but some of these do feel like kind of greatest hits sort of experiences. So tell me about your approach to one-on-ones. You talked about, tell me about approach to hiring, right? What are some other ones that we could brainstorm for people?
Yeah, the classic one is low performer. And then there's collaboration/conflict, or collaboration that was not trivial, especially with other teams, other functions. Maybe if you were in a more product-oriented team, your relationship with the product manager is a really important.
Right, working with partners.
Yeah. So that is another common partner. And the last part is really about execution. How do you actually execute larger projects? Because
how do you structure plans and communicate? Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Those are really good lists of things for people to go back and brainstorm about. You mentioned something earlier I thought was really interesting, that you are often, as a manager or anyone at a high level, you're often telling really long stories, or the stories you have are very long, could be multiple years worth of projects. And here you are trying to deliver that in some very compact amount of time. How do you coach people to deliver those kinds of stories effectively in a tight timetable?
Yeah, and it's the same as writing your resume in a one
Mm.
pager. I know it's a contentious issue. I think being able to write a one pager shows prioritization skills, and that is something you need to have as a manager. So that's just an aside here on why being able to communicate succinctly is important, because it shows prioritization skills. The challenge you have in general in an interview is the information asymmetry. The interviewer comes prepared. They have a list of things they want to talk to you about. They have a certain set of expectations of how they want the interview to run. You do not know that. And one of your jobs in the interview is to figure out what the interviewer is looking for. And you talk a lot about the question behind the question. That is an example of pausing and trying to figure out what the interviewer is looking for. Some interviewers may expect you to go into more depth. Some may want to have a more breadth first interview. You don't know that. And until you develop this understanding, you should be more cautious and more proactive in learning about this in the interview. There are a set of tools that you can use to do this. One of them is to start your answers with a really high-level overview, and then asking the interviewer which part you want me to expand on first. It's the table of content, menu of options, lots of ways to call this approach. And the other one is to really pay attention to the interviewer's body language. Some interviewers like to use seemingly innocent remarks such as got it, or uh-huh, or okay, as subtle signals for you to stop.
Right. Yeah.
And you need to pay attention to that. So it's about proactively having short answers, having a back and forth with the interviewer, so that through the interactions in the first 10 to 15 minutes, you can identify what style they prefer. And it's through proactively paying attention as you're talking to their body language, so you can stop and ask the interviewer, let me pause here. Is there another area you want to cover, or do you want me to continue going here more in depth?
You talked about different types of interviewers, and I think a lot of people who they've been through different interviews in their life, they're thinking, oh yes, I remember this kind of interviewer or this kind of interviewer. Are there different kinds of interviewers for manager interviews versus IC interviews, or like what what kind of different types have you seen?
So I think it's as varied as IC interviews. I don't think I've seen anything that I would call out separately, specifically for manager interviews. There are interviewers who go in just going in to ask question A, B, C, D. There are those that will have a more really optimized for having a back and forth and forming a deeper connection with you. Those are the two main personas in general. And then in manager interviews, there are some risks there, and some interviewers can over-index on their own experiences and can put more weight to something maybe that you mentioned kind of as an aside, and just choose a no hire just based on that.
What's an example of something like that?
So a lot of examples can be on, if you managed a quote unquote low performer and they had issues at home, and you really decide, okay, let's give them time, etc. And this manager just went through a similar situation maybe half a year ago. They gave this person more time, and they ended up having to let them go after some projects were left. People on the rest of the team had to carry extra weight. And so they were recently burned by something like that.
Right.
And then they may project their own experiences on the specific situation. And the reason for that is I always joke there's only one correct answer to any management question, which is it depends.
Yeah.
It depends on the situation. And because of that, you run into a bigger risk of stumbling on someone's recent pains.
So how do we avoid this stumbling?
Yeah. And so I think it's to start with the it depends and to talk about that. Don't just talk about the specific steps that you took. Talk about what else you considered, what went into your judgment, what frameworks or systems you've used based on your own lived experience and those of the managers you learned from. And when you're explicit about that, that can help diffuse some of the risks. So if you talk in this example of a quote unquote low performer who has family issues, you can proactively talk about the risk of waiting too long and acknowledge that most managers don't want to fire people. And so you know that this is a common risk for managers to wait too long. And in this specific case, it was still the right thing to do because.
Right. So providing that justification and providing the backstory that they need. We talked about different types of interviewers from their personality types, how they approach the interview, but there are also different roles, right, oftentimes. So maybe you're interviewing with the hiring manager directly, it could be a director. Maybe you're interviewing with a cross-functional partner, like a product manager or a design manager or something like that. So how do we change or adjust our approach based on who we're talking to?
Yeah. So one of the things I recommend here is to role play how you'd behave with these functions in the actual interview. You need to start by understanding what do they value, what incentives do they have in place, and what are the language gaps between your functions. Language, not English to Brazilian, but between engineering and design. A lot of cross-functional communication is developing that understanding and being able to act as a bridge and on the one hand, and on the other hand, find those win-win collaborations, solutions based on understanding what every function actually cares about. And so in the actual interview, that's something you should also be conscious about and trying to understand what does design in this organization actually care about.
Yeah, makes sense. A lot of interviewing advice you read on the internet, it talks to you a lot about how you can connect kind of emotionally with the interviewer, model their body language and how you introduce yourself in the very beginning and those kinds of things. And I find a lot of that advice probably doesn't apply or is less applicable to the average IC interview. Is that also the case for these leadership interviews where it's just about the content, it's not about how you say it, or it's not about your connection with the person, it's just about what you say? Is that true for manager interviews?
So yes and no. The answer is it depends. There are manager interviewers who would go into a manager interview and just go about asking question A, B, and C and just go guns blazing, really tunnel visioned into collecting the signals. It is less common. It is more common to have an interviewer who starts with forming this human-to-human connection with you.
They're people managers, right? Probably people managers that are interviewing you, so they have this kind of people-y thing that they do.
Yeah, exactly, and it's derived exactly from that. That's something you need to do as a manager. You're a people manager. You need to manage humans, and human connection is really important. That's why in the one-on-one pyramid, it starts with building trust. It's the same thing in the interview. You need to establish some rapport with the interviewer. I would still start with that information gathering about what is this interviewer's style, try to figure out what's their approach and meet them where they are. So that would be my first recommendation. And the second one is still focus on the content, but the delivery does actually matter. The usual advice here is pretend you're having a conversation with a coworker. So pretend you're having a conversation with a manager peer. Easier said than done. That's the frame of mind you should try to get into.
Yeah, makes sense. And you are more likely in these loops, I would assume, to be interviewed by people who are going to be directly on your team, right? People who have beyond a company-wide interest in your candidacy, they have a team or personal interest in your candidacy, right? And so I think that they are not just evaluating you from a can you do the job perspective, but do I want to look at you for 8 hours a day while you do this job, right?
Yes, and some companies will explicitly guide people against doing that. Regardless on company policy, that always is a factor because we're all human.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of, since we're collecting all this behavioral signal, and behavioral interviews are so important for managers, it's likely that we'll have many behavioral rounds, like many conversations with people who are considered a behavioral interview. How do I think about telling the same stories, all different stories? Like, how should I handle that kind of situation?
Yeah, so shift left. Get as much of the work done to the pre-compute to the work you do in that two-phase story selection process where you select the stories, then you filter them based on challenge. And what you have after you do that is what you have. Ideally, you don't want to bring stories that you filtered out back in because you find yourself, I only have one conflict story and I know I'm going to be asked that twice or three times. Because the story you filtered, there's a reason you filtered it out. Now, one thing you can do is, again, give a menu of option to the interviewer. You can say, yeah, I can talk about this conflict or that conflict. And in how you frame that, you guide the interviewer to choose option A, and they know you've done this more than once. Besides that, in most cases, if the same dimension appears in multiple interviewers, there will be a different main theme for each of the interviews. One of them will really be about how you lead without authority. One of them can be about how you lead when you do have authority and how do you exercise or not exercise your authority. And so you can tell the same story with a slightly different focus if you know what the interviewer is actually looking for in that specific interview.
Right. Maybe the hiring manager is looking for your ability to drive the execution of the team, but then the cross-functional partner is looking for how you communicated with other parts of the business. While you can tell this story in a different trailer or different version of it. I like that. Okay, makes a lot of sense. So if people are out there preparing for manager interviews, what are some pitfalls? What's your greatest hits of things that you tell your coaching clients?
Yeah, so I'll actually give an updated version just from this week after being at the Pragmatic Summit, talking to a lot of hiring managers about the challenges of hiring in 2026, including behavioral interviews. What I tell people is the interviewer always has an implicit confidence factor or trust factor on every part of your answer. They may or may not trust as much of what you're saying. With LLMs, sometimes we see that bleed into the behavioral interviews as well. And so this is a bigger concern today than it was 2 years ago.
You talk about cheating. That's what you're talking about.
Yes. It's cheating, yes.
Yeah.
And as an interviewer, to some extent, I don't care about the answer you give my question. The only thing I care about is the answers to my follow-up questions where I drill deeper and where neither you nor I could really expect what I would ask as a follow-up question. It depends on what I hear as an interviewer. And so a general recommendation is to try to shift more of your content to the follow-up questions through the techniques we already discussed by giving short answers, giving multiple options. You can subtly guide the interviewer to choose option A and C and not B. But it's really about the follow-up questions. And so have even more of a bias for short initial answers and have a dialogue with the interviewer. That's a way for you to show the interviewer that you're willing to talk about what they actually care about. So that would be one recommendation. The second recommendation, which we already discussed as the common manager who was recently burned by something, And so always talk about the pros and cons, the different approaches that you went into. A common mistake is just talking about what you did, and it sounds very generic, very synthetic. You need to make it feel real. And one way to make it feel real is to talk about what was going through your head as you were going through this. And that can help diffuse some of the recency bias that some of your interviewers may have.
Yeah.
Those are two common pitfalls. Another feedback I find myself talking a lot about, which ties into both of the things I just talked about, is talk about people, talk about the interactions you had with humans, and call them out by name. Like say, I was working with, let's call her Jane. Like, don't use her real name, respect her privacy, but bring the actual people and bring the actual places where the conversations took place. That makes it feel much more authentic, especially with LLMs these days. And another benefit is our brains are wired to remember faces and to remember places. And when you talk about people and places, your brain will fill your cache so that when you get that follow-up question, you'll remember more details. You'll be at a better place to react to maybe a surprising follow-up question.
Right, or even there's a benefit to having the interviewer hear this kind of detail. Maybe they're more likely to remember parts of the story that are relevant for you, right? Because they've anchored into these more sort of what we might call traditional story elements, like a movie producer might think about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One that I frequently encounter in conversations with managers is managers just love to talk. And that's the job, right? A lot of communication, a lot of them in a meeting, saying something to other people. And then here they are in a meeting, saying something to someone else, the interviewer. So how do you see that? Do you see that like managers tend to talk a lot? And if they do, how do you kind of coach them into focusing?
So there's still variance, but it happens more than with ICs. And what's the right communication strategy? It depends. Think about presenting to an executive for an executive review. Executives don't appreciate managers who ramble. They appreciate direct answers. They appreciate getting to the point and being concise and succinct.
Right.
That should be your starting point. That's the approach. Some useful tools is to have a structure. So when you get the question, pause. You don't need to answer right away. Collect your thought. Choose a storytelling structure to use. That can be Carl. That can be something else, depending on the situation.
Which is context, action, result, learnings.
Yep. Yes. Context, action, results, learning. So choose a structure and then start talking. Having a structure will force you to be more coherent and to be more concise. Sometimes the stories are bigger for manager interviews. And so we have a double whammy. We have people who like to talk a lot, and we give them a lot to talk about. And so that choosing a structure, pausing to choose a structure is really important. Starting with a menu of options, you can start with something, this was an 8-month project with 20 engineers, hands on keyboard. These are the big milestones we had. These were the challenges in each of these milestones. Which one do you want me to start on first is another technique to have a more condensed and high signal communication approach.
I love that. Awesome. Any parting words for people preparing for manager interviews? Any thoughts you have?
The job is hard. The market is hard, and it's not going to get easier. I expect companies will want to hear your thoughts on how you bring AI into management, not just into engineering, how you manage AI-first companies, and how you use AI to scale yourself. We've been seeing flattening of organization for the past couple of years, and I don't foresee that going away anytime soon. So how you scale yourself as a leader is going to be a bigger and bigger component of these interviews moving forward.
Yeah, makes sense. Gilad, thanks so much for coming by and talk about manager interviews. It's been a lot of fun. Tell me more about where people can find out about you.
Yeah, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn and on managementdeltas.com.
Why don't you spend just a moment telling us about Management Deltas? What is it, and what makes it different from other coaching programs?
Yeah, so Management Deltas is a different way of looking at management and a cohesive system of how to approach management, of how to approach the it depends for the different situations, and also how to approach it with yourself internally. Because as an IC, you write code, you see it in prod, you get a dopamine cycle. As a manager, you don't have that as much or as often, and it's also much less visible. You can be really proud of an engineer you helped them grow, but no one will know that you did that. So there are a lot of unique mental challenges as well as a manager. And the Management Deltas approach is really about coming to terms with that and building a system that will energize you so you can do great work for the long run.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thanks for coming by. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.